Putin doesn't want peace and Russia is trying to gain time to continue the war with Ukraine. The US may walk out of the talks. Why would Russia try to weaken the US? We are talking about all this with Andreas Umland, analyst of the Stockholm Center of Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Umland, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start our conversation with the following. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says that Europe will increase sanctions pressure on Russia. To what extent, in your opinion, do such persuasive statements correlate with the real actions of Europe?
Just the last sanctions round, the 17th, was adopted, and there's already preparation for the 18th round of sanctions. What is now happening is that the sanctions are getting more resolute, more frequent. So there is indeed a correlation, so to say, between the rhetoric and the actions. The problem with the European Union is that it is a large organization with 27 countries, and everybody has to be on board. That's why, on the one hand, the sanctions are large because so many countries are involved. But on the other hand, the agreement of the sanctions usually takes time. So what I now expect to see is actually that there will be more effective sanctions now coming than during the last 3 years.
And now we are talking about the 18th sanctions package. So you think that the 17th is more effective, and what can we say about the 18th? This sanction package was announced by Ursula von der Leyen a few days ago.
What we know is that focus of these currently adopted sanctions, already agreed as sanctions in this so-called 17th package, will be the tanker fleet, which has been one of the instruments, the illegal, in fact, tanker fleet or shadow tanker fleet that has been used by Russia to circumvent the previous sanctions on the energy sector. And this is a very touchy issue for Russia, and we have already seen that Russia is actually ready to escalate in the case that these sanctions are being implemented. So what I expect now is not only that these sanctions will become more effective, but also that Russia will more aggressively react to the new sanctions.
Let's start with the Merz call on Trump. He said that he asked Trump to join the sanction pressure. However, Trump is still trying to reach an agreement with Putin. Just yesterday, the US president tried to talk to Putin again, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one who has a logical question. Under what circumstances can Trump tighten sanctions? Do you have a vision of such a situation? I would be grateful if you could share your thoughts on this issue with us.
Yeah, this is a rather strange issue because the approach that Trump is currently having with Putin, or that at least he's pronouncing that he has with Putin, is that he wants to keep the conversation going and that he therefore thinks that pressure on Russia is not good. But of course, this conversation lasts already 11 years. We have the various negotiation rounds for 11 years now, and this hasn't brought any results. And so far, this has not had any success, but still Trump is continuing that instead of joining the European Union in this new attempt to pressure Russia.
And Friedrich Merz announced the increase in sanctions pressure after his conversation with Trump. Does this mean that Trump is not against Europe tightening sanctions? May the announcement of increased sanctions be an indication that the conversation between Trump and Putin didn't go well enough?
That's a good question, whether the US will actually react to new European sanctions. But so far, it seems that now the US and the European Union will be more and more departing in their policies towards Russia. Earlier, they had been coordinating them. Now there may be this divide, and one can only hope that Trump will not try to pressure the Europeans to follow his own course, which is, of course, a mistaken approach and will not have any results. There may be another agenda that Trump has here, perhaps economic interests. Perhaps he is obliged in one way or another towards Trump. So one can only hope that at least if the US indeed is sort of now departing from a joint Western policy towards Russia, it will not hinder the Europeans to exert more pressure on Russia, and that there will be no contradiction then in the policies by, on the one side, the White House, and on the other side, the European Union.
And how would you comment on the sequence of Trump's phone call? First, a call to Zelensky, then a call to Putin, and then a call to Zelensky again. What do you think Trump was trying to achieve with this series of phone calls, and what did he actually achieve?
Well, at least he is trying, or he seems to be trying, or let's say he's trying to create the picture that he's trying. And all these phone calls were perhaps indeed meant to have a result. The problem is that the demands that Russia is providing now, or is putting up vis-a-vis Ukraine for 3 years, are just so scandalous and so much in contradiction to the most elementary rules of international law that there's very little between Russia and Ukraine to negotiate, actually, unless Russia changes its position. There's also here what we see now, a repetition of an earlier attempt by other US administrations to achieve some sort of reset in their relations to Russia, to start them anew. We had that with the Obama administration. The Bush Jr. tried to do something like that. And now Trump is trying to reset the relations between Russia and the US. And maybe he will succeed to some extent, but it will not be to the benefit of Ukraine if he succeeds. So far, this is all going in the totally wrong direction. The whole approach is ridiculous. The pressure should have come first and then negotiations. But what we're having now is negotiations or attempted negotiations without any pressure, and they are doomed from the outset to be unsuccessful.
J.D. Vance says that the U.S. is determined to walk away from the peace negotiation because the U.S. is not going to stand still. Can the U.S. now simply afford to leave or step aside the negotiation process?
That's a good question. I think that's certainly what Trump and Vance and others in the current U.S. administration want. The problem here for them is that Ukraine still remains popular in the U.S., that also U.S. help for Ukraine remains popular, more so among Democrats than among Republicans, but still the majority of the population of the United States is in favor of U.S. support for Ukraine and is critical of Putin. And so they can walk away, but the problem is then how that will then play out in, let's say, the next elections for Congress in 2026. So there will be also pressure here domestically on the White House to achieve something and not to spoil then these elections for the Republican Party in the next round of the congressional election. So I think that is the main reason, actually. The other factor here is that, of course, the international partners of the U.S. are unhappy. The Europeans, Japan, Australia, these are all close friends of or used to be close friends of the US, and they are also friends of Ukraine, and they will not welcome that. Now also the new Pope is obviously on the side of Ukraine in this entire international conversation. So I think they would have already walked away from these negotiations. But the problem is that both inside the US and outside the United States, there are many people who are trying to influence the White House to keep on trying to achieve some result and not to simply walk out.
Bloomberg writes that if Trump withdraws from the negotiations, then Putin wins. I'm trying to build the logic of the actions of the involved parties in such situation. If Russia refuses to ceasefire, Trump may withdraw from the negotiations. But it is obvious that if Trump wants peace the way Ukraine wants it, then it would be logical for the US to continue supporting Ukraine. What is your opinion?
Yes, the problem here, to my knowledge or my view or my impression, is that what is actually necessary is a continuation of Biden's policy towards Ukraine, or a more resolute implementation of Biden's course towards Ukraine, namely military support for Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. And that Trump simply doesn't want to do that because that has been Biden's policy. And that is one interpretation. There may be also other motivations here that we don't know. One can also suspect that there's a certain affinity or even sympathy between Trump and Putin. Trump in general seems to like authoritarian leaders more than democratic leaders. He has perhaps also some false hopes concerning economic cooperation with Russia. So all of that is hindering him, and what is hindering, let's say, U.S. support for Ukraine. What hinders Trump to simply end all of his efforts and all American support for Ukraine is, as I mentioned, public opinion in the United States, and also the advocacy, so to say, from especially the European partners, Germany, Great Britain, France, the European Union, and so on, who continue their support for Ukraine and who want also the United States to stay on board.
Putin believes that he can increase his influence in Europe only by weakening the US. How do you think? Does Donald Trump understand this? And how do you see the end of US loyalty to Russia?
Yeah, I guess maybe Trump even understands that to a certain degree. The problem is that he's not against it. He's sort of not so much interested in Europe. He wants to withdraw troops and so on. But and that is, of course, a problem for Europe and especially for Ukraine at a first glance. At second glance, the result of all of this is actually for Russia or for Putin's interests ambivalent, because this estrangement between America and Europe has led to a new feeling of unity in Europe, to a rise of the popularity of the European Union, to new policies of the European Union and also of the member states of the European Union, and also to a new sense of unity between the fate of Ukraine and the fate of the rest of Europe. And in particular, the scandalous conversation in the White House between Zelensky and on the one hand and Trump and Vance on the other has led to a shock in Europe, and this shock has been in a way good for Ukraine, because there's now in my perception, at least, and I'm speaking from Stockholm, but also Germany, not only in Sweden, in Germany, in France, in Britain, there's a new understanding that Ukrainian victory is in the core interest not only of Ukraine, but also of Europe as a whole and also of the European nation states. That's not a fully unified view so far. There are other countries like Serbia and Hungary and Slovakia who may have another point of view, but the major Western countries are now basically all united in their interpretation of the Russo-Ukrainian war and its importance for Europe.
And how do you think, is it dangerous for the NATO countries if there will be a ceasefire in Ukraine? I mean, the danger from Russia.
Yeah, there is now a discussion about that, and the assumption here is that if there is a stable ceasefire, then Russia will have, so to say, free capacities to attack NATO and EU member countries. From a security policy point of view, I understand this fear. However, if I look at the recent history of Russian behavior, and if I try to imagine how people in Moscow think, I don't think there's really that much of a danger of such an attack by Russia against a NATO or EU member country. That is certainly something that Putin wants to project. We have now, for instance, this activity along the Finnish border on the Russian side, and Putin wants to scare Europe with such a large war. But even if he has then free capacities once there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, I don't think that we should immediately expect some sort of invasion of, I don't know, Estonia, Finland, Poland, or Lithuania.
And Russian propagandists are threatening that Zelensky, with his current position, could lose more than 4 regions. Vladimir Zelensky clearly says that Ukraine won't give up its territories and NATO membership. Where can there be points of contact, and what are the remaining opportunities to negotiate peace?
I'm afraid there are now no opportunities to successfully negotiate. I think what is first needed is that Russia gets into economic problems or experiences new defeats on the battlefield, or even better, experiences both of it, domestic socio-economic problems and defeats on the battlefield. Then negotiations make sense. Then perhaps there can be some sort of solution be found where both Moscow and Kiev could be more or less satisfied, or to which they would agree. But currently, I think this approach is simply to negotiate something is simply doomed to fail, because there's no interest of Russia in a negotiated solution. Russia, in principle, does not accept the Ukrainian nation state. It wants to incorporate Ukraine into a Russian empire, and only once the Russians understand that this is not possible because Russia is too weak domestically and is defeated on the battlefield, then they will stop doing that. As long as none of these conditions are fulfilled, negotiations are senseless.
Yes, and return to Friedrich Merz's statement. He started that at the moment there is no point in talking about peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. According to the German Chancellor, first there should be a ceasefire and a stop of the killing. It's a clear logic, I said, but what do you think about the prospect of the presence of peacekeeping contingents on the territory of Ukraine? What could they be?
I'm afraid that is something not for the near future. That can be something once Putin is pressured into a ceasefire. Currently, the situation is actually such that the very announcement of Western troops on Ukrainian territory is hindering a ceasefire. So Putin has made it clear that he doesn't want any Western troops on Ukrainian territory. And if then the West says we want to put our troops there, but only if there's a ceasefire, well, there will be no ceasefire then. So this is actually now, in a very strange way, this whole idea has become now, in a way, counterproductive to a ceasefire. And it illustrates just once more how senseless and even paradoxical currently the negotiations are, because the interests are so diametrically opposed. I think what would now already make sense, and you don't need a ceasefire for that, is to implement the old idea of no-fly zones over Ukraine, over the nuclear power plants, over Kiev and other cities, over other infrastructure that is vital for Ukraine, and that Russian drones and ballistic missiles are not only shot by Ukrainian air defense system, but also by Western fighter planes, for instance, that would be patrolling over Ukrainian territory, perhaps the western and central parts rather than the southern and eastern parts, and that would be protecting then the rear of Ukraine against such attacks by drones and missiles. That can be already done now. You don't need a ceasefire for that. No Russian soldier would be killed in such if there's such interception of unmanned Russian flying vehicles. But it would be a huge help to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian army if Western fighter planes and other air defense systems could be supporting the Ukrainian air defense system over Western and Central Ukraine.
Mr. Andreas, I'm very appreciate you for this conversation. I ask our viewers, please push the button like under this video and leave your comments. And I would like to remind you that Andreas Umland was my guest today, is the analyst of the Stockholm Center of Eastern Europe Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you.